everyone. Jessica Morales joining you with my colleague Jennifer Presley, Executive Editor of E&P. We also have with us PESA President Leslie Beyer. Jennifer and I want to have a good conversation with you. We know this is not positive times that we're in, but there are resources that we know you're providing. We want to get that message out as much as we can. You've actually been sending out newsletters referring to the PESA War Room. I think that's what your newsletter is. Is that beyond a newsletter, if you will? Is that a way of looking at this time to just kind of band together and get through it?
It is. I think there's kind of a dual meaning there. Definitely, we're all in this together. We have to work together to really kind of get through this, especially in the industry. But that's also a little bit of a throwback to just my political roots. When we started compiling everything and deciding, what we were going to call this, in my mind, it went to war room because that's the political connotation on any kind of campaign where you have the team together, they're pulling in all the resources, they're collaborating, they're trying to bring everything together in one space to be able to get it out immediately. And so when we started to do that, that's what it felt like for us as the workflow changed, as the situation for Oilfield Services changed, and we transitioned into kind of this remote position of being able to still bring our people together. And that's what PESA does so well. We still bring our people together. And as we kind of had to change that workflow, it felt like a war room to me from my DC days. So that's what we called it. It won't always be that way. But it's kind of a political connotation there.
How is PESA helping its members? What are some of the resources that it has provided for its members?
We changed the workflow to go to remote collaboration. And so that is that, and then our advocacy are the two primary avenues that we're really using right now to support the members. So we are, in terms of government affairs, definitely working with allies in Congress, on Capitol Hill, and the administration to make sure that the oilfield services sector is represented in any kind of stimulus package. That is a primary area of advocacy for us. And I can get into the details of that a little bit. And then the second part of our workflow is about bringing our members together to share best practices in this COVID-19 operational environment, mainly specifically around supply chain issues, health and safety. There were stop work orders that were different in different states and in different local areas. We were having to compile that information and get it out quickly. There were best practices recommendations on PPE and social distancing protocols in control rooms and on rigs. And so all of our member companies are coming together right now multiple times a week. We have 22 different committees at PESA. And so all those different groups are getting together each week and really sharing how they're navigating the environment. And then we're compiling all of that for all of our members and putting it out on the war room. And so that's really kind of what we're doing for them right now. And we're hearing from the members more quickly than you would, anywhere else, exactly what the situation is in the field. And so as the executive teams work on their strategy issues and they try to kind of ramp down, there's the teams, the HSEQ teams, the supply chain coordinators, the HR teams, how are we helping our people? How are we still supporting our people? For those who can't work from home, all of that collaboration is going on right now. And I've just been so pleased to see how in our sector, oilfield services is so competitive, but everyone is coming together and saying, hey, look, here's what our emergency response team came up with. Here's our plan. We are happy to share that with you because, again, we're all in this together. At the end of the day, getting our people back to work and getting the economy going again is what's going to be the answer to this. And so, I've really seen the PESA members coming together on that.
And is that something, if you can expand more on what you're hearing from the PESA members, you said that you're hearing from them more quickly, I guess, than you would have thought. Is that some of it, that we need to help each other, or what else are you hearing from them?
We're hearing that they're all making cuts. There's layoffs and furloughs kind of across the board at 20 and 30%. And you hate to see that, but they're right sizing for very limited activity in North America. And that's just a necessity. They're also still investing in R&D though. And that, I think, is the most critical part of the oilfield services sector, is that, these companies, this is where all of the technology and innovation comes from that resulted in the shale boom. And these companies have to stay healthy enough to continue to invest in R&D so that when we do get past the demand destruction, we're ready to go again. And so those companies are quickly trying to make the cuts that they can to be prepared for when we see demand return, is really what we're hearing.
So what are your thoughts on the current challenging market conditions that the industry is experiencing? What are you hearing from your market analysts that are part of the organization?
Well, from the analysts, we definitely hear, that there's a lot of consolidation in the sector. It was a very fragmented sector. We knew that. That's happening, quicker than we thought would need to happen, but that's just accelerated all of that. And in that, it's accelerating the digitalization and the move to automation. These companies, because they're already having to mitigate this damage, they're doing things that they had maybe planned to do a little further down the road. They're just going to get there quicker. And so that's why they're trying to cut early, invest in R&D, invest in digitalization and in their workforce, and hanging on to the people they have and taking care of them so they can ramp back up. But on that same foot, you hear that from the analysts. And then also, we hear things in Washington. The demand destruction is partly, or it is ultimately, done by the federal government. These are restrictions. The federal government has made these restrictions that are resulting in the demand destruction. And so the federal government has to be part of the solution. And, you see every day different thoughts and ideas on policy ideas that could potentially help the industry. But generally for oilfield services, and that's, who we are primarily focused on, the stimulus packages have been broadly beneficial. And what's important is to make sure that the pieces of the Green New Deal that kind of try to get injected in each one of these stimulus packages don't hinder our companies. We have to make sure that oil and gas isn't discriminated against in any stimulus package. And that is what's actually happening. There's a lot of those conversations going on in Washington. And so, we really have to make sure that oil and gas is not excluded. And we have allies in Congress and in the administration that are trying to make sure that doesn't happen. And they're working really hard to do that. And we're trying to just continually maintain those contacts and talk about how important oilfield services is. Because what they're trying to get to at the end of the day is saving jobs. And when you're talking about jobs in the energy industry, that's the oilfield services sector. We are the ones that, that drive the technology and house most of the jobs, 500,000 in the US alone. So as policymakers want to hang on to jobs, they have to make sure that any stimulus includes oilfield services.
I think you've touched on it, of course, but if I can ask you, Leslie, the personal side of leading and organizing associations such as PESA, what are things that are, I guess, keeping you up at night, or that you hear CEOs are being kept up, and leaders are being kept up at night about? Can you expand a little bit more about it personally, how it feels for you to be able to listen to what they need, advocate for them? And really, I know these conversations are constant, of course, with the policymakers.
They're constant. And I think you touched on something that's important, and it's part of ESG that I wanted to talk about. But, everyone's mental health in this environment is impacted. Whether you are at, the sea level or you've just been laid off in the field, it is across the board impacting everyone mentally. It impacts the workflow. It impacts, your family at home. And so hearing just constantly how people are working to manage this, it's very difficult. And so, and we had to change into that workflow just overnight. And in a lot of people's cases, they're working twice the amount they were before, trying to be in a rapid response position. That's kind of, I feel like, where we are. And you also have your kids at home. I mean, I'm on Zoom calls all day, and it's not, irregular that a 12-year-old will like walk behind me looking for the bacon. Is there any bacon left over? Well, I'm presenting my financials. Can you hold on one second? So I think it's just really has changed how everyone works. And we did actually a webinar on mental health through our ESG committee. One of the leaders on that ESG committee from Schlumberger and Marie Quebec had recommended that we do a mental health webinar, and we had a ton of people sign in and get a lot out of it. So I think that's important. And that kind of, I guess, gets back to your question, like how we're hearing from everyone. We're hearing differently, what is impacting everyone differently. And with those 22 different committees, the committees are the ones that come up with the ideas and say, look, we need to do an external call on what's happening in digitalization right now in supply chain. It's driven by all the member companies, and maintaining constant contact with them is how we can make sure we're hitting the right topics.
So you mentioned the ESG, and certainly even, with the bacon, that brings a definite human element to all that we do in the business. And then on the ESG, I know that you have some resources there for companies that what are you seeing on that side? Because certainly, the argument could be made that ESG is, while still important, it's not as important as it may have been before. Right. So what are you hearing on the ESG side?
It's interesting. I think you do hear a little bit of that, and then you hear from the companies who have embraced it as a model of looking at their business holistically. They see this environment as an ESG issue. This falls right in line with the ESG, all under the social, taking care of your team and focus on safety. This is, at the end of the day, for us, this is all about getting our people back to work in a way that they feel safe. And that's an ESG issue. The environmental piece, I think, that's where people are tempted to say, well, we'll focus on that later. But that's not the case. There's been enough damage at this point to demand that the companies really are just going to have to accelerate where they were headed in energy transition to a lower carbon future, and embracing more of those ESG elements of, looking at the governance, making sure that there's diversity on boards. These companies, when they do come back, are going to have to be 100% ready to go on all of that. And so right now, while you're mitigating that destruction and the damage to the business, is when you build up and make sure that you're focusing on everything through that ESG lens of environment, social, and governance. And all that is looking at the business just across the enterprise, mitigating risk in those areas.
Definitely put the S in ESG.
Yes,
we are finding.
Sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned, companies already going in a certain area, and maybe even this wasn't what you were saying specifically, but some companies, with the cyclical industry having trouble or reorganizing things, and then just overnight, this demand destruction just changed out of nowhere, essentially, in a business.
Right. And compounded because, we were already, the oilfield services pricing hadn't even recovered from the 2014 downturn. Right. And so we were just kind of getting back there. And then a lot of companies, once the Russia-Saudi price war started, they began to struggle. And that has actually ultimately impacted some of the stimulus access for some of our companies, because you had to be a certain investment grade by mid-March, March 23rd, I think. And the price war had affected a lot of the companies before that. And so, oilfield services, they don't have the balance sheet, that a producer has. And so it's just different. And so we've been working with companies to try and, get some exclusions or, try and get them more access to stimulus because of certain areas. You know, another thing that came out in the Paycheck Protection Program under the CARES Act, companies that were private equity backed were at sometimes not eligible. You know, that's a lot of oilfield services. So we've been trying to take those two areas and focus on, you know, companies that are getting excluded because of their investment grade before March 23rd and being private equity backed, trying to help them also get some stimulus activity.
Mm-hmm.
That's important information to know also, that, you know, that's why it's so helpful to have the association, I imagine, that with the knowledgeable group coming together.
Right. Well, I appreciate you saying it that way. And, you know, it's almost like being a member of a trade association is a little bit like insurance sometimes. There are companies that, you know, you see them cutting, they're having to lay people off, and the optics of, you know, a discretionary spend on a trade association when you're having to lay someone off, that's not great. Even I recognize that. However, you have, you know, basically a compliance and government affairs and supply chain shop on speed dial that you're not paying, you know, for a full-time employee. And that's what makes the difference. And in this kind of environment, that is when trade associations are really supposed to accelerate. And I think you have seen them do that. And I know that kind of gets back to the war room mentality of where we are. You know, when we saw this happen and you see, you know, that your companies need support, you ramp it up fast and you try to be for them what the employees were that they lost. And those who are actively and appropriately leveraging their trade associations are doing that. You know, they're calling, they're like, hey, we're stuck on this one thing. Can you help us? Absolutely. And so, you know, it's almost like hedging. It's like insurance, but it's a good insurance plan to be a member of PESA.
Thank you so much for all the hard work you're doing for the oilfield services sector, and all the information and resources you're providing.
Thank you so much, ladies, and thanks for Leadership at Heart. And Rich Eichler has just been such a strong partner for us, and we just really appreciate everything y'all are doing too. So thanks.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We appreciate that.
For more Hard Energy videos, follow our social media channels.